Welcome back to Fox and Friends. Whether taking Texas to federal court over its new photo ID requirement or challenging attempts to curb voter fraud in Florida, Attorney General Eric Holder says he's not backing down.
This Justice Department's efforts to uphold and enforce voting rights will remain aggressive. And I have every expectation that we'll continue to be effective. The arc of American history has always moved towards expanding the electorate. It is what made this nation exceptional. We will simply not allow this era to be the beginning of the reversal of that historic progress.
All right, so history. Let's put this in perspective. Does Eric Holder's argument hold any water? Joining us now is presidential historian Nick Ragone. Nick, great to see you as always.
Good to see you, Clayton.
All right, so let's dive into some of the history of this. He says that historically we've always expanded the electorate in the United States of America. Do you disagree with that, or do you agree?
Well, he's right. Directionally, we have. In 1965, LBJ passed the Voting Rights Act, which was really a companion to the Civil Rights Act, which created a situation where southern states can no longer disenfranchise African-American voters. That was a landmark piece of legislation. In the last 30 years, the vote has expanded, but in the last 5 or 6 years, really, states have been trying to crack back on fraud, which has become a really, really big issue. And so I think Attorney General Holder is confusing those two issues.
Okay, so that's interesting. So his point is that when you enact these voter ID laws, that you're going to keep voters away from the polls. Therefore, you wouldn't be expanding the electorate. But we have some historical context here, and I want you to take us through what happened in Georgia back in 2006 when they instituted their own voter ID law.
Yeah, exactly the opposite happened. In 2006, they did a voter ID law, and what they saw is increased turnout pre and post. So in 2004 to 2008, turnout dramatically increased among minority voters. Now, some would say, well, that was due to President Obama. Well, if you look at the congressional elections as well, pre and post, that increased too from 2006 to 2010. Again, turnout among minority voters increased. Now, that's not to say there's a causal relationship between the actual law and increasing turnout, but it just means that it didn't suppress turnout, which is what Attorney General Holder was claiming would be the case.
Right, that's one case where we saw an expansion. He, though, made the case in his argument to the NAACP that this voter ID law in Texas, he likened it to Southern poll taxes, which, if our audience doesn't know what Southern poll taxes were, it was post-Civil War. There were taxes imposed on African Americans to go to the polls and vote. Would you say that that's accurate?
No, I mean, it's a very, very difficult argument to make. I mean, as I mentioned, the 1965 Voting Rights Act really tried to do away with some of those insidious things like poll taxes, literary taxes, even grandfather clauses. What the current laws are doing, and a lot of states have photo ID laws, and there's lots of different types of IDs, from government IDs to passports and whatnot. They're just trying to crack down on fraud, which we've seen an increase in fraud. And so most people aren't aware that you don't need, in a lot of states, you don't need any form of ID other than a registration card. And most polls show that voters support some sort of photo ID to prevent fraud. So I think the Attorney General is looking at the issue a little bit differently than the historic case from 1964 and 1965.
And I misspoke. He didn't say that to the NAACP convention. He said that when he was down there in Arizona talking just last week. Just want to correct that. Nick Ragone, always great to see you. Thanks for correcting the record here this morning on the historical aspect.
Good to see you again.
Thanks, Nick. Coming up on the show, the Department